This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G.K. Chesterton. Section 3, Chapters 7 through 9. The Appetite of Earth. I was walking the other day in a kitchen garden, which I find has somehow got attached to my premises, and I was wondering why I liked it. After a prolonged spiritual self-analysis, I came to the conclusion that I like a kitchen garden because it contains things to eat. I do not mean that a kitchen garden is ugly. A kitchen garden is often very beautiful. The mixture of green and purple on some monstrous cabbage is much subtler and grander than the mere freakish and theatrical splashing of yellow and violet on a pansy. Few of the flowers merely meant for ornament are so ethereal as a potato. A kitchen garden is as beautiful as an orchard. But why is it that the word orchard sounds as beautiful as the word flower garden, and yet also sounds more satisfactory? I suggest again my extraordinarily dark and delicate discovery that it contains things to eat. The cabbage is a solid. It can be approached from all sides at once. It can be realized by all senses at once. Compared with that, the sunflower, which can only be seen, is a mere pattern, a thing painted on a flat wall. Now it is this sense of the solidity of things that can only be uttered by the metaphor of eating. To express the cubic content of a turnip, you must be all round it at once. The only way to get all round a turnip at once is to eat the turnip. I think any poetic mind that has loved solidity, the thickness of trees, the squareness of stones, the firmness of clay, must have sometimes wished that they were things to eat. If only brown peat tasted as good as it looks! If only white fir wood were digestible! We talk rightly of giving stones for bread, but there are in the Geological Museum certain rich crimson marbles, certain split stones of blue and green, that make me wish my teeth were stronger. Somebody staring into the sky with the same ethereal appetite declared that the moon was made of green cheese. I never could conscientiously accept the full doctrine. I am a modernist in this matter. That the moon is made of cheese I have believed from childhood, and in the course of every month a giant of my acquaintance bites a big round piece out of it. This seems to me a doctrine that is above reason, but not contrary to it. But that the cheese is green seems to be in some degree actually contradicted by the senses and the reason. First, because if the moon were made of green cheese, it would be inhabited. And second, because if it were made of green cheese, it would be green. A blue moon is said to be an unusual sight, but I cannot think that a green one is much more common. In fact, I think I have seen the moon looking like every other sort of cheese except a green cheese. I have seen it look exactly like cream cheese, the circle of warm white upon a warm, faint violet sky above a cornfield in Kent. I have seen it look very like a Dutch cheese, rising a dull red copper disc amid masts and dark waters at Honfleur. I have seen it look like an ordinary sensible Cheddar cheese in an ordinary sensible Prussian blue sky. And I have once seen it so naked and ruinous looking, so strangely lit up, that it looked like Gruyère cheese, that awful volcanic cheese that has horrible holes in it, as if it had come in boiling in unnatural milk from mysterious and unearthly cattle. But I have never yet seen the lunar cheese green, and I incline to the opinion that the moon is not old enough. The moon, like everything else, will ripen by the end of the world, and in the last days we shall see it taking on those volcanic sunset colours and leaping with that enormous and fantastic life. But this is a parenthesis, and one perhaps slightly lacking in prosaic actuality. Whatever may be the value of the above speculations, the phrase about the moon and green cheese remains a good example of this imagery of eating and drinking on a large scale. The same huge fancy is in the phrase, "if all the trees were bread and cheese," which I have cited elsewhere in this connection, and in that noble nightmare of a Scandinavian legend, in which Thor drinks the deep sea nearly dry out of a horn. In an essay like the present, first intended as a paper to be read before the Royal Society, one cannot be too exact, and I will concede that my theory of the gradual vire science of our satellite is to be regarded rather as an alternative theory than as a law finally demonstrated and universally accepted by the scientific world. It is a hypothesis that holds the field, as the scientists say of a theory, when there is no evidence for it so far. But the reader needs to be under no apprehension that I have suddenly gone mad, and shall start biting large pieces out of the trunks of trees, or seriously altering, by large semicircular mouthfuls, the exquisite outline of the mountains. This feeling for expressing a fresh solidity by the image of eating is really a very old one. So far from being a paradox of perversity, it is one of the oldest commonplaces of religion. If anyone wandering about wants to have a good trick, or test for separating the wrong idealism from the right, I will give him one on the spot. It is a mark of false religion that it is always trying to express concrete facts as abstract. It calls sex affinity. It calls wine alcohol. It calls brute starvation the economic problem. The test of true religion is that its energy drives exactly the other way. It is always trying to make men feel truths as facts, always trying to make abstract things as plain and solid as concrete things, always trying to make men not merely admit the truth, but see, smell, handle, hear, and devour the truth. All great spiritual scriptures are full of the invitation not to test but to taste, not to examine but to eat. Their phrases are full of living water and heavenly bread, mysterious manna and dreadful wine. Worldliness and the polite society of the world has despised this instinct of eating, but religion has never despised it. When we look at a firm, fat, white cliff of chalk at Dover, I do not suggest that we should desire to eat it. That would be highly abnormal. But I really mean that we should think it good to eat, good for someone else to eat, for indeed, for someone else is eating it. The grass that grows upon its top is devouring it silently, but doubtless with an uproarious appetite. Symonds and the social tie. It is a platitude, and none the less true for that we need to have an ideal in our minds with which to test all realities. But it is equally true, and less noted, that we need a reality with which to test ideals. Thus I have selected Mrs. Buttons, a charwoman in Battersea, as the touchstone of all modern theories about the mass of women. Her name is not Buttons. She is not in the least a contemptible nor entirely comic figure. She has a powerful stoop and an ugly, attractive face, a little like that of Huxley, without the whiskers, of course. The courage with which she supports the most brutal bad luck has something quite creepy about it. Her irony is incessant and inventive, her practical charity very large, and she is wholly unaware of the philosophical use to which I put her. But when I hear the modern generalization about her sex on all sides, I simply substitute her name and see how the thing sounds then. When on the one side the mere sentimentalist says, "Let women be content to be dainty and exquisite, a protected piece of social art and domestic ornament," then I merely repeat it to myself in the other form. Let Mrs. Buttons be content to be dainty and exquisite, a protected piece of social art, etc. It is extraordinary what a difference the substitution seems to make. And, on the other hand, when some of the suffragettes say in their pamphlets and speeches, "Woman, leaping to life at the trumpet call of Ibsen and Shaw, drops her tawdry luxuries and demands to grasp the sceptre of empire and the firebrand of speculative thought," in order to understand such a sentence I say it over again in the amended form. Mrs. Buttons, leaping to life at the trumpet call of Ibsen and Shaw, drops her tawdry luxuries and demands to grasp the sceptre of empire and the firebrand of speculative thought. Somehow it sounds quite different. And yet when you say woman, I suppose you mean the average woman. And if most women are as capable and critical and morally sound as Mrs. Buttons, it is as much as we can expect, and a great deal more than we deserve. But this study is not about Mrs. Buttons. She would require many studies. I will take a less impressive case of my principle, the principle of keeping in mind an actual personality when we are talking about types or tendencies or generalized ideals. Take, for example, the question of the education of boys. Almost every post brings me pamphlets expounding some advanced and suggestive scheme of education. The pupils are to be taught separate. The sexes are to be taught together. There should be no prizes. There should be no punishment. The master should lift the boys to his level. The master should descend to their level. We should encourage the heartiest comradeship among boys, and also the tenderest spiritual intimacy with masters. Toil must be pleasant, and holidays must be instructive. With all these things I am daily impressed and somewhat bewildered. But on the great Buttons principle I keep in my mind and apply to all these ideals one still vivid fact: the face and character of a particular schoolboy whom I once knew. I am not taking a mere individual oddity, as you will hear. He was exceptional, and yet the reverse of eccentric. He was, in quite sober and strict sense of the words, exceptionally average. He was the incarnation and the exaggeration of a certain spirit, which is the common spirit of boys, but which nowhere else became so obvious and outrageous. And because he was an incarnation, he was in his way a tragedy. I will call him Simmons. He was a tall, healthy figure, strong, but a little slouching, and there was in his walk something between a slight swagger and a seaman's roll. He commonly had his hands in his pockets. His hair was dark, straight, and undistinguished, and his face, if one saw it after his figure, was something of a surprise. For while the form might be called big and braggart, the face might have been called weak, and he was certainly worried. It was a hesitating face, which seemed to blink doubtfully in the daylight. He had even the look of one who has received a buffet that he cannot return. In all occupations he was an average boy, just sufficiently good at sports, just sufficiently bad at work to be universally satisfactory. But he was prominent in nothing, for prominence was to him a thing like bodily pain. He could not endure without discomfort amounting to desperation that any boy should be noticed or sensationally separated from the long line of boys. For him to be distinguished was to be disgraced. Those who interpret schoolboys as merely wooden and barbarous, unmoved by anything but a savage seriousness about tuck or cricket, make the mistake of forgetting how much of the schoolboy life is public and ceremonial, having reference to an ideal, or, if you like, to an affection. Boys, like dogs, have a sort of romantic ritual which is not always their real selves, and this romantic ritual is generally the ritual of not being romantic, the pretense of being much more masculine and materialistic than they are. Boys in themselves are very sentimental. The most sentimental thing in the world is to hide your feelings. It is making too much of them. Stoicism is the direct product of sentimentalism, and schoolboys are sentimental individually, but stoical collectively. For example, there were numbers of boys at my school besides myself who took a private pleasure in poetry. But red-hot iron would not have induced most of us to admit this to the masters, or to repeat poetry with the faintest inflection of rhythm or intelligence. That would have been antisocial egoism. We call it showing off. I myself remember running to school, an extraordinary thing to do, with the mere internal ecstasy in repeating the lines of Walter Scott about the taunts of Merriman or the boasts of Roderick Dhu, and then repeating the same lines in class with the colourless decorum of a hurdy-gurdy. We all wished to be invisible in our uniformity, a mere pattern of Eton collars and coats. But Symonds went even further. He felt it as an insult to brotherly equality if any task or knowledge out of the ordinary track was discovered even by accident. If a boy had learnt German in infancy, or if a boy knew some terms in music, if a boy was forced to confess feebly that he had read The Mill on the Floss, then Symonds was in a perspiration of discomfort. He felt no personal anger, still less any petty jealousy. What he felt was an honourable and generous shame. He hated it as a lady hates coarseness in a pantomime. It made him want to hide himself, just that feeling of impersonal ignominy which most of us have when someone betrays indecent ignorance. Symonds had when someone betrayed special knowledge. He writhed and went red in the face. He used to put up the lid of his desk to hide his blushes for human dignity, and from behind this barrier he would whisper protests which had the hoarse emphasis of pain. "Oh, shut up, I say! Oh, I say, shut up! Oh, shut it, can't you?" Once, when a little boy admitted that he had heard of the Highland Claymore, Symonds literally hid his head inside his desk and dropped the lid upon it in desperation. And when I was for a moment transferred from the bottom of the form for knowing the name of Cardinal Newman, I thought he would have rushed from the room. His psychological eccentricity increased, if one can call that an eccentricity which was wild worship of the ordinary. At last he grew so sensitive that he could not even bear any question answered correctly without grief. He felt there was a touch of disloyalty or unfraternal individualism even about knowing the right answer to a sum. If asked the date of the Battle of Hastings, he considered it due to social tact and general good feeling to answer 1067. This chivalrous exaggeration led to bad feeling between him and the school authority, which ended in rupture unexpectedly violent in the case of so good-humoured a creature. He fled from the school, and it was discovered upon inquiry that he had fled from his home also. I never expected to see him again, yet it is one of the 2 or 3 odd coincidences in my life that I did see him. At some public sports or recreation ground I saw a group of rather objectless youths, one of whom was wearing the dashing uniform of a private in the Lancers. Inside that uniform was the tall figure, shy face, and dark stiff hair of Symonds. He had gone to the one place where everyone is dressed alike, a regiment. I know nothing more. Perhaps he was killed in Africa. But when England was full of flags and false triumphs, when everybody was talking manly trash about the whelps of the Lion and the brave boys in red, I often heard a voice echoing in the under caverns of my memory, "Shut up! Oh, shut up! Oh, I say, shut it!" Cheese. My forthcoming work in 5 volumes, The Neglect of Cheese in European Literature, is a work of such unprecedented and laborious detail that it is doubtful if I shall live to finish it. Some overflowings from such a fountain of information may therefore be permitted to sprinkle these pages. I cannot yet wholly explain the neglect to which I refer. Poets have been mysteriously silent on the subject of cheese. Virgil, if I remember right, refers to it several times, but with too much Roman restraint. He does not let himself go on cheese. The only other poet I can think of just now who seems to have had some sensibility on the point was the nameless author of the nursery rhyme which says, "If all the trees were bread and cheese," which is indeed a rich and gigantic vision of the higher gluttony. If all the trees were bread and cheese, there would be considerable deforestation in any part of England where I was living. Wild and wide woodlands would reel and fade before me as rapidly as they ran after Orpheus. Except Virgil and this anonymous rhymer, I can recall no verse about cheese. Yet it has every quality which we require in exalted poetry. It is a short, strong word. It rhymes to breeze and seas, an essential point. That it is emphatic and sound is admitted even by the civilization of the modern cities, for their citizens, with no apparent intention except emphasis, will often say "cheese it," or even "quite the cheese." The substance itself is imaginative. It is ancient, sometimes in the individual case, always in the type and custom. It is simple, being directly derived from milk, which is one of the ancestral drinks, not likely to be corrupted with soda water. You know, I hope, though I myself have only just thought of it, that the 4 rivers of Eden were milk, water, wine, and ale. Aerated waters only appeared after the fall. But cheese has another quality, which is also the very soul of song. Once, in endeavouring to lecture in several places at once, I made an eccentric journey across England, a journey of so irregular and even illogical shape that it necessitated me having lunch on 4 successive days in 4 roadside inns in 4 different counties. In each inn they had nothing but bread and cheese. Nor can I imagine why a man should want more than bread and cheese if he can get enough of it. In each inn the cheese was good, and in each inn it was different. There was a noble Wensleydale cheese in Yorkshire, a Cheshire cheese in Cheshire, and so on. Now it's just here that true poetic civilization differs from that paltry and mechanical civilization which holds us all in bondage. Bad customs are universal and rigid, like the modern militarism. Good customs are universal and varied, like native chivalry and self-defence. Both the good and bad civilizations cover us with a canopy and protect us from all that is outside. But a good civilization spreads over us freely like a tree, varying and yielding because it is alive. A bad civilization stands up and sticks out above us like an umbrella, artificial, mathematical in shape, not merely universal but uniform. So it is with the contrast between the substances that vary and the substances that are the same, wherever they penetrate. By a wise doom of heaven, men were commanded to eat cheese, but not the same cheese. Being really universal, it varies from valley to valley. But if, let us say, we compare cheeses with soap, that vastly inferior substance, we shall see that soap tends more and more to be merely Smith's soap or Brown's soap, sent automatically all over the world. If the Red Indians have soap, it is Smith's soap. If the Grand Lama has soap, it is Brown's soap. There is nothing subtly and strangely Buddhist, nothing tenderly Tibetan about his soap. I fancy the Grand Lama does not eat cheese. He is not worthy. But if he does, it is probably a local cheese, having some real relation to his life and outlook. Safety matches, tinned foods, patent medicines, are all sent all over the world, but they are not produced all over the world. Therefore there is in them a mere dead identity, never that soft play of slight variation which exists in things produced everywhere out of the soil, in the milk of the kine or the fruits of the orchard. You can get a whisky and soda at every outpost of the empire. That is why so many empire builders go mad. But you are not tasting or touching any environment, as in the cider of Devonshire or the grapes of the Rhine. You are not approaching nature in one of her myriad tints of mood, as in the holy act of eating cheese. When I had done my pilgrimage in the 4 wayside public houses, I reached one of the great northern cities, and there I proceeded with great rapidity and complete inconsistency to a large and elaborate restaurant, where I knew I could get many other things besides bread and cheese. I could get that also, however, or at least I expected to get it, but I was sharply reminded that I had entered Babylon and left England behind. The waiter brought me cheese, indeed, but cheese cut up into contemptibly small pieces, and it is the awful fact that instead of Christian bread he brought me biscuits. Biscuits, to one who had eaten the cheese of 4 great countrysides; biscuits to one who had proved anew for himself the sanctity of the ancient wedding between cheese and bread. I addressed the waiter in warm and moving terms. I asked him who he was that he should put asunder those whom humanity had joined. I asked him if he did not feel, as an artist, that a solid but yielding substance like cheese went naturally with solid yielding substance like bread. To eat it off biscuits is like eating it off slates. I asked him if, when he said his prayers, he was so supercilious as to pray for his daily biscuits. He gave me generally to understand that he was only obeying a custom of modern society. I have therefore resolved to raise my voice not against the waiter, but against modern society for this huge and unparalleled modern wrong. End of chapters 7 through 9.